What's up, legends, and welcome back to another Unmatched Adventures strategy guide. This is volume 2. I am considering the theory crafting slash analysis of the format video I did before to be the volume 1 video. There might be something in the corner if I remember to put it there right now, linking you to that video if you haven't seen it yet. Probably a good idea to watch that one first, but in today's video, we are going to be starting kind of the more formalized strategy guide approach that I take to normal heroes, but we're going to be applying it to adventures, which is kind of like doing a strategy guide about the villains cards and the minions cards and how each individual of those decks functions as a whole to try to make your life miserable and breaking them down from there. That way we can start to kind of understand how to better beat them. And just like in my strategy guide series, all of these enemies have a similar quote-unquote common card in their deck that I feel like talking about first and building a baseline of is very important for going forward. And the card that is in all of the enemy decks is Deception. That is kind of like the Feint equivalent for the enemies, although like obviously it doesn't do anything similar to Feint, but in that all of the decks have this card, and it gets much easier to just talk about this card all at once than repetitively mentioning it in each of the enemy breakdown videos I will make. So it just makes sense to get a good starting point here, as Deception is kind of like a key card to strategize around in the format, and understanding how it works, although it's relatively simple, gives us a good understanding and foundation going forward for understanding the adventures format. Quick reminder to hydrate in case you have not today. I've got my water and my coffee here. I will be drinking them in between me talking. I'm going to edit it out, of course, so that you're not just hearing me in between slides. But yeah, this is just a reminder to hydrate, homies. Here, I'll take one sip on the mic right now. I don't know if you can hear that because I'm using a straw, but here, I'll take a slurp of the coffee. I'm so sorry if you don't like that sound, but this is just your reminder to drink some fluids. All right, let's get into the video. So Deception. Deception is, like I said, a relatively simple card. It is currently in all of the enemy decks because the Adventures format would not function without it. Let's break down the card first and then go from there. So Deception will be an enemy-specific card. There is currently one copy in all of the enemy decks. I'm not 100% sure about the boost value. That probably should have been something I checked before starting to record, but let's just assume it's all 3, and if I'm wrong, someone will definitely correct me in the comments and I'll like pin it or something or give them a gold star. But Deception, it is a 0 value attack, 0 value block. And it says, whenever this card is put into insert enemy here's discard pile, shuffle its discard pile back into its deck, including this card. This effect cannot be canceled. So this card essentially functions to keep the enemies coming after you forever. Because a normal endgame scenario in competitive or 1v1, free-for-all, 2v2, whatever you're doing, is that your hero's deck is finite. Once you run out of cards, usually, some heroes like Daredevil and Winter Soldier can kind of circumvent this, but usually that means the game is going to end soon because you're going to be needing to draw cards. You won't be able to, and you'll take that fatigue damage, 2 damage per card you could not have drawn. That will kill you very quickly. In Adventures, to prevent the enemies from having 30 card decks, there's this neat little design thing they did that basically they added one card in their deck that whenever it's put into the discard pile, meaning if it's played as an attack or a block, or it gets discarded by some of your player effects, it triggers an immediate reshuffle of all of their cards and resets their deck. Which means that the enemy will never exhaust, they'll never fatigue, they will never run out of cards, and it means you actually have to kill the enemies in order to prevent them from taking actions. It is such a clean and perfect way of implementing this. There's like a thematic difference between the enemies and the heroes, that the heroes are only mortal, they're human, and like eventually they will run out of gas, whereas the enemies are just this unrelenting force of evil that is trying to steal all of your crops and or destroy all of your public infrastructure, and nothing will stop them from doing that. And of course they added the "this effect cannot be canceled" clause, just so that it was crystal clear that this effect will always trigger, and if there's some combat interactions with cancels, doesn't matter, always going to reset the deck. So like I said, Deception currently in every enemy's deck. I believe it would be in every deck going forward, but I never know what these clever folks at Durdle/Restoration will come up with for future adventure sets. So that's why that's in italics. And essentially, just like I said before, you can't run away from the enemies in order to kind of like outlast them. Because if you run away and prevent them from like triggering their movement and attacks, they're just going to increase the threat level. And that is a very unsustainable way to deal with the enemies. In terms of like the actual like attack or block card, it is just a 0/0, which does nothing as an attack. Kind of usually means that you wasted a card, unless you have some "if you won the combat" contingent effect on your card, in which case this is basically a free win. But most of the time when the enemy deck reveals the Deception as an attack against you, you played a card, you're like, oh, I just wasted my skirmish on this, and that feels a little bit bad. On the other hand, when this is played as a block against you, that feels really, really good, because it is effectively nothing. The enemy took it undefended, essentially, which means all of your damage is going through, all of your effects are going through, and you feel really, really good about yourself after that. If you're Bigfoot and you played your regroup as an attack, you're going to wish you played your log, but oh well, at least you drew those two cards. So a lot of the strategy and risk mitigation and things like that in this format come down to playing around or perhaps into Deception, because you should be monitoring the enemy decks and keeping in mind the relative probability that the card that is going to be on top of their deck when you attack them or when they attack you is Deception, because you can take some calculated risks and take attacks hoping that it's Deception if you don't have any good blocks in your hand or you don't want to waste a card, or you can swing for the fences and hope to hit big into essentially a nothing burger on defense. So this card creates mind games in a format where you're playing against an automated deck, which is absolutely phenomenal. It simulates the enemy taking attacks, and it adds a mechanic in that kind of keeps the format alive. This card is awesome. World's tiniest round of applause to whoever thought of this. I don't want to give Jason and Darren all the credit in case it was like Rob Davio's brainchild, but this is such a clean way to make this format work, and it creates such good game moments where it's like, oh, why did I defend? Or, oh, why didn't I play my log? Just truly phenomenal. So speaking of calculated risk, this is just a chart showing the probabilities based on the cards left in the enemy deck about what the odds are that you draw Deception next. I believe Mothman has 10 cards in his deck. I don't think there's an enemy deck with more than him right now. And some of the decks are as small as 6 cards. I believe Skunk Ape's deck, I should say, starts with 6 cards. So the starting probability is between 10 and around 17%, which isn't great, but once you get into like that 4 or below category, I think that is kind of a great time to start figuring out like which cards are exactly left in their deck and like what are the odds if you take an attack or things like that. Obviously, if there's one card left in the deck, it is deception, and that gives you a great deal to plan around. That's always fun, but there are always some fun moments when there's like 2 or 3 cards left in the deck, and you're like, all right, but what if I take this? It could be really bad, but like if it's deception, that's going to be so good, since card value, card advantage are all things that work a little bit differently in a cooperative, and if you can hang on to as many cards as you can, that in the long run helps a lot. So taking attacks is kind of like a necessary evil in this format, so sometimes you got to rely on coin flips to bail you out, but it is such a good feeling when you're just like, yeah, I'm gonna just reshuffle its deck, I'm just gonna like take the attack, and that's another deception. It's like, nice. So yeah, let's talk about some specific adventures, interactions with other things that kind of affect this card besides just the card itself. The first one is Suspension Bridge. So this comes when you are playing on Point Pleasant, specifically against Mothman. Suspension Bridge is one of the 4 bridges that will randomly get, I was going to say spawn, but like built seems like a better word. One of 4 bridges that will be randomly erected at the beginning of the game. That bad baked goods. So anyway, Suspension Bridge has the bridge effect that says reveal the top 2 cards of an enemy deck, discard 1. This is a very powerful effect, since normally when you get to look at like an enemy's hand, you just get to look at the top card of their deck. If you get to discard a card from them, you just discard the top card of their deck. So it's very random and like can give you some information, but is really limited. This and effects like the Golden Bat card or the Moon Knight card that let you look at the top 3 cards of their deck give you a little bit more information and can help you sequence things, and are in general very powerful for predicting or essentially knowing what's coming next. So you get to reveal the top 2 cards of the enemy deck, meaning that all the players at the table get to see them. It's a cooperative format, so I don't know why you wouldn't show and tell the other players, but maybe your friend group is just built different, bro, and you don't play like that. So cool. Maybe you're playing in a special challenge mode where you just can't talk to anyone, or you can't like give them any information about your hand or like enemy knowledge. I guess that would actually be kind of cool. But all right, so anyways, we're digressing. I'm digressing. You're just along for the ride. Looking at the top 2 cards in the enemy deck and choosing 1 to discard. This is really good for setting up either like a really weak attack or a block, and or getting rid of a really nasty attack or block. It is awesome when there's like, especially for the Martian deck, and then I remembered that this is not ever active when you're playing against the Martians. So there are certain enemies with nasty one-offs, specifically the Martians, but ignore that for this purpose. There's some minions with some nasty one-offs as well, that if you can discard those and kind of like miss them on the reshuffle, is awesome. Because then you just don't have to deal with it until the next time that a deception comes out. And just knowing what's coming up next in the enemy deck is amazing. There is a caveat though, and that is the random ordering of initiative. Unless you know that this enemy has already gone this phase and you have some players coming up in the turns after, you can't necessarily be 100% sure that the things you are trying to line up, because if the enemy hasn't gone yet, the card on top of the deck that you put back could be used as an attack or a block, depending on if a player goes before that enemy and can attack them, or if the enemy goes before a player, which is kind of annoying because obviously if you reveal the deception, you would like to put it on top of the deck and then have a player like swing big into it, but it can be a little unfortunate if you put it on top of the deck, then the enemy goes next and then just attacks with it, when that could have been a substantial amount of HP that it just lost when you got to attack into it. That being said, if you ever discard the deception with this effect, that actually will trigger the deception, because it says whenever this card is discarded, and you will cause an immediate reshuffle and you won't know what card is on top of the deck. So I recommend not doing that. Also, if you play Suspension Bridge when Deception is the only card left in the deck, you will discard it and reshuffle it. So just like, don't do that. Just go attack the enemy if it has one card left in the deck. And like I said, the bridges are randomly constructed at the beginning of the game in the various bridge slots. There's 4 of them. And typically, Mothman will add Doom to the lowest numbered bridge. So bridge 1, and then when that one gets destroyed, 2, then 3, then 4. But he does have a card that adds Doom to all the bridges. And I mentioned Doom because when you use the bridge effects, you are discarding a card to get rid of Doom. I feel like that is like usually the primary thing that you are using the bridge for, although there are certain bridges like the heal bridge and the draw bridge especially that are typically worth using even when you're not necessarily clearing any Doom. I would say this bridge probably also worth it, depending on the round/turn that you're trying to set up. Definitely with the initiative order messing up kind of like what the top card gets used as makes this a little bit less of an auto use, but like the drawbridge is good enough to just use without having any Doom. But basically the bridge position matters because if the suspension bridge is bridge 1 or 2, you're typically going to be using that bridge a lot early in the game. Maybe not on the first turn, even though there is one Doom that starts on bridge number 1, but definitely after like a round when more Doom gets added from Mothman's card effects or end of round effect, you're going to be using bridge 1 a lot early in the game. And so if this bridge is bridge 1 or 2, this will give you a lot of early Doom info, or not Doom info, but early deck info. And I think that makes it a great tool for clearing out minions, because early in the game, a lot of times you want to stabilize by quickly and efficiently dispatching a minion or 2. That way the action economy swings a little bit more either in your favor or more towards being balanced, because at the beginning of the game, the enemies get way more actions than you do. Essentially, there is another body that they have because there is a minion for each player and the villain, and then they also have end of round effects, which are pretty nasty. So getting rid of a minion as early as possible is usually the first step in trying to win any adventures game, and definitely knowing what the top card of their deck is and or setting up like a weak defense for you to just slam into. Usually with like 2 or 3 hits, especially if one of them is big because you set up a small block on top of their deck using the suspension bridge, is a great way to start removing minions off the board. And having this bridge in one of those early bridge slots makes that pretty useful and possible early in the game. If this bridge is bridge number 3 or 4, you'd have to go a little bit more out of your way to get that info early game. You probably wouldn't be removing any Doom. You'd be just discarding the card for this effect, which, in my opinion, the opportunity cost is kind of high there, because instead of removing Doom from one of the low bridges and or getting that bridge's effect, especially if it's the drawbridge, you're kind of not engaging in any of the enemies early in the game, which means your teammates are probably getting ganged up on, and you are not like stalling the game by removing Doom. You're just hoping to hit big, and just revealing 2 cards, like especially in like a 10 card deck early in the game, isn't necessarily going to like guarantee you the reveals you're looking for, especially with all of the enemies like good cards still in their deck. Like later in the game when the enemy has like 4 or 5 cards left in their deck, you can kind of judge how useful this suspension bridge effect is going to be, because you know the odds of like, do they have like a bunch of big hits left in their deck, or is it all just like weaker stuff? But I think at bridge, what I'm trying to say is at bridge 3 or 4, This usually will be like a late game effect that'll help you clutch the game against the villain. It is a lot less useful early in the game just because you have to go out of your way and spend resources on something that doesn't immediately stall the game state by removing Doom, if that makes sense. So let me know what your thoughts are. We're going to talk about the bridges more when I make the Mothman video, but just wanted to talk about some of the other game mechanisms that interact with deception, because obviously knowing for sure that deception is at the top of an enemy deck is amazing, because it basically just gets you a free hit, but just make sure that you are setting it up with good timing based on the initiative track. The first amazing event I want to talk about, specifically with its interaction with deception, is They Strike from the Shadows, which in my opinion is probably the second most impactful event. Strike from the Shadows says, whenever you shuffle an enemy's deck, put its deception card on the bottom of its deck. So now deception will always be the last card in the enemy deck, which certainly affects how you have to approach the game, because now you know that instead of randomly being able to hit a deception somewhere in the middle of the deck, you know it's going to be at the bottom, which means that you're never going to get early reshuffles. You're never going to get like random lucky hits into the deception. You know that you have to go through all of the enemy's deck, all of their real cards, in order to get to this quote-unquote fake card at the bottom of their deck, which usually is a bad thing, because you can just get a lot of like free damage in the game by just like randomly hitting into deceptions. And now that that possibility is no longer active, you might have to play like a more honest game where you're actually relying on hitting over the top of block values in order to deal damage. Just makes everyone a little bit tankier and will make the game go a little bit longer. So keep that in mind when this event is in play. It does add certainty to the last two cards of the deck, because you know the bottom card is Deception, which means when there's only one other card on top of it in the deck, you should be able to sort through the discard pile and figure out exactly what that card is, which can lead you to some beneficial scenarios, just because knowing what card is going to get played next will make a heck of a difference. But those enemy decks with a bunch of cards, like specifically Mothman has 10, you got to get through all of the annoying cards, and he certainly has some annoying cards, which is annoying. In my theory crafting and analysis video for Unmatched Adventures, which I put in the corner at the beginning of the video, maybe I'll put it in the corner again, maybe I'll just make a playlist with both of these videos and say, watch the other one first. But this does increase the value of discards, bait attacks, and action gains, which I initially was not too keen on for this format, just because enemy blocks and cards like function differently than player blocks and cards. Cards as like a resource mean a lot less to enemies because they have an infinite number of them, so them discarding one like doesn't really matter. You playing bait attacks also like doesn't really matter because they have an infinite number of blocks to block with, and most of the time like a bait attack kind of isn't doing anything. Similar with action gains, because those are typically attached onto like low value attacks, but now all of those things get a lot better when you know that the deception is at the bottom of the deck, and you grind through the enemy deck in order to hit it, because now when they discard the top card of their deck, one card closer to being the deception. The bait attack also gets you one card closer to being the deception. You never kind of like waste an attack, like you never, as Little Red, you never play hands into the deception and like feel bad. You're like, oh, I could have played a basket and dealt double the damage, but now you are intentionally trying to mill the enemy deck to get to that bottom card to set up a big hit, which definitely changes the way you play the game. You don't have to specifically play that way, because obviously you can still deal damage to the enemy over their normal blocks. Some of them still aren't even that good, but kind of that swing for the fences play of trying to get a big hit on a deception no longer is kind of like semi-random, and intermittent. It is spaced out as far as it can be, and that actually does help you. It is beneficial in the fact that you can plan for it, although I think the negative effect definitely outweighs that slight positive. The next amazing event we're going to talk about and its interaction with deception is they have skin like stone, which says enemies cannot take more than 3 combat damage when defending. Boy, oh boy, do I absolutely hate this event. I hate it. It's my least favorite event, typically because if I can, I will run Raptors in adventures, and boy, oh boy, do the Raptors hate this card, just because when you buff your attack value all the way to the moon, and the event is like, actually, no, you can't go higher than 10 feet, really, really feels bad. But the main way that I viewed deceptions before this event was, aha, the enemy is taking the attack, have a free shot. But now, enemies cannot take more than 3 combat damage when defending. So it's kind of like that Tomoe goes in blue card, where it says Tomoe can't take more than 2 damage from combat. It's like that, but with 3, which is not really a lot of damage when you think about it, because now, unless you have after combat damage or some sort of ability damage, it's going to take 4 attacks at least to kill minions. Like if they just weren't blocking anything, every time you attack them, it was capped at 3 damage. It's 3, 6, 9, and then 1 more for the 10, which turns deceptions into like actually solid blocks, which is annoying. Because now when you hit into it with a log, it's, oh, I'm taking 3 damage instead of 6. So typically, if you have guaranteed deceptions based on like bridges or deck knowledge or anything like that, you don't actually want to swing for the fences, because it's going to cap the combat damage you can do at 3. You want to use those like mid-value, like ideally 3-value attacks into a guaranteed deception, and then just try to hit bigger over normal blocks, since it can only take 3 damage. So if they're blocking for like 3, you'd have to hit them with a log in order to deal max damage from that. And when you don't have deck knowledge, this can be very swingy, because if you just throw a random log out, the deception comes out and bam, it's only 3 damage. So this definitely changes the way you have to approach attacking enemies, just because it makes them a lot more durable, and there's no more like big chunks of combat damage being dealt, no more kind of like swingy burst turns. You have to take a little bit more of a measured approach, unless you have after combat or effect damage, in which case you just ball out. Like, this is your time to shine. The next amazing event is they have no weakness, which says deception cards have a value of 3. Sheesh. This functions a lot like the last event we just talked about, but now instead of capping damage at 3, deception cards have a value of 3, which I think in the long run might prevent about the same amount of damage. It's actually kind of interesting how that works, but basically now there's like absolutely no more free shots. The enemies are always going to be blocking, and you can kind of use the other blocks in the enemy deck to kind of like math out what the average block value of their cards are going to be. I know that's something I definitely take into account when trying to attack enemies, but this also has like a defensive repercussion for you, because now there's no more like whiffed attacks. When the enemies hit you with deception, they're hitting you for 3, which is definitely not nothing. So it makes the enemies hit harder, it necessitates more blocks, and it makes the enemies definitely tankier, just because they're basically always going to be blocking for something. Yeah. This this event isn't necessarily the end of the world, just because like taking and blocking for 3, or I should say attacking and blocking for 3, like it isn't nothing, but it's also like not something, if that makes sense. It just means that you kind of have to plan out what your attacks are going to be and kind of plan to meet more resistance when you're revealing the enemy cards. And the next amazing event I want to talk about is Their Wounds Close. Whenever you shuffle an enemy's deck, it recovers 1 health. So this isn't necessarily an event you can play around per se, just because the effect is always going to trigger and there's not much you can really do about it, but it essentially adds, after combat, recover 1 health to the Deception card. Because after you shuffle the deck, the enemy is going to recover 1 health. Which kind of, in the long run, on average, will probably heal the villain, maybe like anywhere between like 3 to like 7 or 8 health, depending on where those deceptions end up, and kind of turns like early offensive deceptions into annoying things to deal with, because it's a bait attack, may have made you waste a card, and it heals the enemy 1. Versus when you attack into a deception with a wounds close, the healing won't actually trigger until after the enemy shuffles, which would be after the entire combat, which means if you just kill the enemy while attacking into the deception, this doesn't matter at all. Probably doesn't matter a lot with minions either, but depending on how many early deception and reshuffles they get, could maybe heal them like 1 to 3 points of health. But I definitely think this affects the villain way more than the minions, and can be a little bit annoying in that regard, because like having the villain go from like 20 to like 25 health actually I think is a lot more than it seems. This card actually has like almost anti-synergy with the amazing event that puts Deception at the bottom of the deck, because now there's like less healing because the time between reshuffles is maximized, which I think is a little funny how that works, but neat little thing there. This definitely makes offensive deceptions a lot more annoying than defensive ones, because a lot of times if they just block with a deception, like the 1 health doesn't really matter. They're blocking for 1, but you're just dealing a lot more damage into it. But on offense, definitely a little bit less you can do, since most of the time you're not dealing damage back when you're blocking into enemies, depending on the character you're playing, which means that the enemy's kind of just getting like a free interaction and free healing, which is a little bit annoying. And the last event I want to talk about is Their Strength Grows, which says add +1 to the value of all minion attacks. So in the context of adventures as a whole, definitely makes the game a little bit harder. But in the context of just deception, it turns deception from a 0/0 into a 1/0. Ooh, I'm shivering in my boots. I'm so scared. Yeah. Basically means that the enemies now have a regroup in their deck, which, like, I was debating not even putting this slide in just because, like, it's so minimal of an impact, but who knows? That 1 damage might come back to kill you if you ended up dying because you took 1 damage from a deception that you didn't block. That'd be pretty funny. But yeah, kind of not a lot to say here. It's just deceptions are now a 1 value instead of 0 value. So now I think it is finally final thoughts time. And I kind of mentioned this earlier, but I love deception. I love the mind game feel it adds to a mode against effectively a computer. It makes the game have some interesting moments, and mechanically it really helps the enemy decks function, and I think it is probably the most important card for a lot of the enemy decks that you have to play around / into, since getting free hits or taking no damage when you're not blocking is absolutely huge. And you know, I always say I'd rather be lucky than good. Sometimes you gotta rely on luck a little bit in adventures, in addition to Unmatched in general. insert video of Zero winning a 50-50 in the semis versus Phantom. If he had won Game 3 of that series, that probably would have been the most impactful coin flip in Unmatched history. But anyways, sometimes a little bit of randomness is nice. A little bit of unpredictability is like the nice oregano of life, as I think the saying goes. Although I am more of a time guy myself. Doctor Strange, time supremacy. I'm just thinking of the meme image I'm putting over the screen right now in post. But anyways, Deception. Probably didn't need to talk for half an hour about it, but I think, like Feint, it is important to understand the most frequent card you're going to see in Adventures, and just talking about some of kind of like the weird, wacky interactions it has with some of the other Adventures events and mechanics is interesting. So let me know your thoughts on Deception as a card, how you like to plan around it in your Adventures games, and I will see you in the next Unmatched Adventure. Almost forgot the word there. Unmatched Adventures TM Strategy Guide TM copyright. Next Unmatched Adventure Strategy Guide, where we start delving into the enemy decks. Dun dun dun. I will still make team composition videos for Adventures, but I won't necessarily classify those as like strategy guides, since they are like very, very specific, and I don't know, you just might not ever play as that team comp, so like why would I make a guide about that? Alright, anyways, that's this video. Thank you for joining me on this wonderful July afternoon. Not entirely sure when this is coming out, because it's July grind time. I'm trying to achieve my goal of posting a video every day for as long as I can, so we will see when this gets posted. So yeah, Deception, Unmatched Adventures. What a time to be alive. Let's go. So thank you so much for watching, and as always, like, subscribe, and yay!